A new round of Brexit negotiations is underway in Brussels despite bitter disagreements in the Parliament over the manner of exit. Early last week, the UK released its white paper on plans with the EU, something that did not sit that well with the Foreign Minister and the Brexit Secretary. Before we go to our panelists about the latest development, let's take a look at this.
Thorns in Brexit negotiations. The agenda for the latest round of Brexit talks in Brussels this week focused on issues related to a UK white paper on Mrs May's exit strategy from the EU. On Monday, the British Prime Minister barely won a series of votes in Parliament, keeping her contentious Brexit strategy with a few unwanted concessions.
The ayes to the right, 305. The noes to the left, 302.
Pro-Brexit lawmakers first voted 305 to 302 for the so-called customs bill and then approved amendments. The bill will stop Britain from collecting tariffs for the European Union after Brexit unless there is a reciprocal arrangement. Instead of facing Brexit supporters down, the government accepted their 4 amendments and gained final pass of the bill.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that he is absolutely wrong in his reference to the agreement that was reached at Chequers. I would not have gone through all the work that I did to ensure that we reached that agreement, only to see it changed in some way through these bills. They do not change that Chequers agreement.
Mrs May's spokesman said the changes to the bill did little more than put the policy into law, and the government saw the amendments as consistent with the formal white paper last week. The white paper contains May's plan for a common rule book and a close relationship with the EU, which was unveiled after a cabinet rebellion led by resigned Foreign Minister Boris Johnson and Brexit Secretary David Davis. Dominic Raab soon became the new Brexit Secretary. Before their resignations, May and her cabinet had come to an agreement at Chequers for her soft Brexit plan. A complete break or friendly relations with Europe, that is indeed the big question.
For more discussion on Brexit, joining us in the Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, who is the director of the Department for European Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In London, the UK, we are joined by Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Professor. In Brussels, last but not least, we have Daniel Gross, who's the director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Professor Begg. You are coming from the UK. Let me ask you about the latest development, particularly regarding the campaign, rather mistakes made by the official campaign group, which is called Vote Leave, exceeding the budget that it is legally allowed to encourage Britons to vote to leave the EU or Brexit. What does that mean politically for the to leave camp in a way?
Very little, because in practice we're talking about an overspending by hundreds of thousands of pounds. In other words, a relatively trivial amount on an election campaign, and it isn't going to call into question the outcome of the referendum. It may result in the Vote Leave group being subject to criminal penalties, but that's all. I can't see it being turned into something that would alter the outcome. And in any case, if there is close scrutiny of the other campaigning groups, they may well find similar irregularities. So I would discount this as something significant.
You see, there's not only personnel change, there's also campaign, political, legal battles, and many other things. These could be said just little dramas along the way for the grand topic of Brexit. Having said that, though, let me go to Brussels, asking Mr. Gross about that, too. Coming from the EU perspective, what about that political struggle going on inside the UK? The so-called hard and the soft, you'd see it is almost coming to a climax over the past few weeks when the latest plan came into being. I mean, the draft, of course.
Yes, there's continuing uncertainty about what actually the position of the UK government will be. Makes it very hard for the European side to figure out what to expect, what to offer, and how to react to what is coming out of London. Because there's always a feeling that today you get one position paper, tomorrow it will be slightly different, and therefore for the time being we are still waiting here in Brussels for what could be the final position of what the UK actually wants to achieve with Brexit.
Well, not only in Brussels, I guess inside the UK, people do not even know what exactly is that blueprint, isn't it? Talking about blueprint, there is the latest one. Early in July, Mrs. May's cabinet reached an agreement on UK's future relationship with the EU after Brexit, the one that has caused a lot of stir recently. First, keep a common rule book for all goods with the EU, but, quote, different arrangements will be organized for services. The UK will sign a treaty on, quote, continued harmonization with the EU rules to avoid border tension. Some say this is just cherry picking that the May administration is trying to do. So, Mr. Cui, sitting in Beijing, of course, you don't have to go through those political storms, but I'm sure you have your assessment of the latest plan and the overall relationship fight inside the UK about that. Mr. Cui, briefly.
Yes, we are not, involved directly with this Brexit
What a relief.
game. But of course, we keep a very close concern because, as we know, China is an important partner, not only with UK and also with the European Union. So we need to understand what will happen for the future. Yes, I think now the situation, political situation in UK especially, is very difficult one for Theresa May and her government. And how could she keep the balance, very, very carefully between the so-called Leave campaign or Remain campaign. Of course, now it's in another form is soft or hard Brexit.
Right.
Of course, I think also because now Theresa May's government is a very, very weak government. So we can understand this situation. But of course, I agree with our counterpart from Brussels that to some degree this position, especially recent position from the government, is a kind of a tactics for the negotiation.
Okay.
Maybe to firstly calm down some people in UK and also to release some goodwill to the Brussels. But then, of course, at the same time, Theresa May and his government should be prepared for any kind of negative response from other parties.
Well, talking about tactics, there are a lot of tactics being used. Mr. Gross, I have to go to you about Brussels' reaction, which I haven't seen officially so far, about Theresa May as the Prime Minister of the UK in a negotiation with the EU, talking about suggestions coming from the US President Donald Trump, suggesting to her, in her words, which is, Donald Trump suggested me to sue the EU. This is first. And secondly, she also talked about Donald Trump told me that he's going to offer to me a great trade pact that we're likely to have bilaterally, the United States and the UK, despite of the fact that she is not the favorite of Donald Trump, neither is Donald Trump her favorite. So, Mr. Gross, can you help us understand what exactly Brussels is reacting to these two pieces of news, shall we say?
Yes, I think we treat them as pieces of news and perhaps pieces of just gossip, because we know that
Really?
Donald Trump
Gossip?
says many things.
Really?
Yes, because he says many things to many partners, and he is perfectly capable of saying one thing one day and the opposite the next day. So what he might have said to Theresa May is really none of our business here in Brussels. As I said earlier, we are just waiting for an official position from the UK government. What exactly is their negotiating position? As long as they don't do that, there's very little for people in Brussels to do.
Oh, wow. Mr. Gross seems to want to have a rest so far before the next plan comes out, while the storm is going on inside the UK. Professor Bagg, I'm not sure whether you could take your time that leisurely as Mr. Gross.
Well, there are two or three things going on. One is that one piece of Trump advice is sticking with Theresa May, which is to make the UK great. Put the UK first. Her position in this is one which tries to say this is what the UK ideally wants. Now, Theresa May's trouble is that within her main political base, which is the Conservative Party, both the members of Parliament, the party itself and the Cabinet, there is one faction that wants black, another faction which wants white, and she has tried to come up with a shade of grey that satisfies both of them. I think if you want black or if you want white, you're never going to be happy with grey. And we're seeing this playing out all the time in the way the negotiations happen.
Wow.
Now, on the European side, I think there's an important consideration here, which is that for the European side, an alternative to Mrs. May looks worse, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party or a more extreme Prime Minister from the Conservative Party. It'll be far harder for them to deal with. And they are worried that if they say something too negative about Theresa May's proposals, they will undermine her and create a difficulty for themselves.
Professor Begg, you talk about the degree of grey. We all understand there's at least 50 degrees of grey, probably even more. And therefore, which degree will the Prime Minister take? That is likely to be the question, isn't it? I mean, talking about that, there's the issue of what we call the earlier soft and hard at Brexit. There's also to leave and to stay campaigns on both sides. So this is the crucial issue. That is, what is the role of this Prime Minister? Elected into the office with the ultimate mission of so-called a Brexit. But obviously, politics have been moving around and evolving, so is international. So she has to find that perfect, beautiful degree of grey so that she will not be off from her executive office. Meanwhile, there could be a plan eventually to report to the voters.
I think we have to be careful when we're talking about the book called 50 Shades of Grey, because that has different connotations.
That's
However,
true. That is true. That is true.
The story we're talking about here is that Theresa May has tried to make a compromise in the middle. If neither side is happy with it, it risks unravelling. And in the last 2 or 3 days, we've seen real concerns that it's unravelling with a very uncertain likely outcome. There are more voices now saying this has to go back to the people in some form of new consultation, which would mean in practice a second referendum. The trouble here is we're running out of time very rapidly. To get a new referendum in the UK is going to take several months, and the deadline for achieving a deal is now very close. It's either October or December or ultimately March next year, depending on who you listen to. So time is the essence now, and this is the major hazard that the whole process faces.
Mr. Cui, now we all understand that before the end of March 2019, which is just a few months from now, there has to be a result, according to the original plan, about the Brexit. But during this process, a lot of factors will come into being. One is whatever is going on within the internal politics, but without the influence, without not much influence from the outside world, but actually it's the other way around. There's a lot of influence from the other side of the world. So, Mr. Cui, from your perspective, how do you look at the Brexit now, the process itself, reflecting the so-called unilateralism, vis-a-vis what is going on in the United States with President Trump traveling Europe over the past 2 weeks and ended up in Helsinki, and people's view about that version of unilateralism? How are they likely to intertwine or different, Mr. Cui?
Yes, I think it would be a very interesting issue if we look at this Brexit from this angle. Of course, not only a kind of, unilateralism, between the so-called Mr. Trump and, of course, some, I think, the trend reflected from Brexit. I think largely we find out more maybe commonality from this trend in the United States and also in the Brexit is how could this anti-establishment force, they try to find a new way to reshape how it is national interests. If we look at especially the original beginning of the Brexit, how could this political elite to try to take use of a referendum and a kind of a populist movement to redefine the national interests.
Right.
And also what happened in Brexit, especially some populist party, they were so active in during the referendum. And then what happened between especially those political leaders for populist parties in UK, and they are very, very close relations with Mr. Trump. So I think, yes, largely we can find out a more, I mean, very, very deep or root cause of this Brexit process, and in, I mean, a huge change of the politics in UK and some other Western countries.
Mr. Gross, what about from your perspective? What do you make of that, particularly given the recent events over the past few weeks? Very briefly from you, sir.
I think Mr. Trump perhaps was the same strand of populism that made Brexit possible, but he has also shown now that the world dominated by populists like him becomes more dangerous. And for a small power like the UK, it might actually have some advantage of sticking closer to the EU than they had thought in 2016. In 2016, the impression was, we get out of the EU and there's a glorious world, free trade, multilateral system, and we are protected by that system. We don't need the EU. Now the impression is a little bit different.
Yeah.
So in the end, Trump and Brexit might have the same roots, but now I think they are parting company.
Interesting. Professor Begg, what about that? I mean, when President Trump traveled to the UK and to the EU countries, there were demonstrations following him throughout the traveling route. So would that make the British people think twice? Those demonstrations, including those in the UK. So would that make the UK people think twice about what kind of future they want? The siren already sounding at the background. Professor Begg, you want to help us to understand it?
Yes, the siren's just across the road from me outside the House of Commons, but maybe something's going on there. But I think the answer is that the British people are deeply split. There are many, particularly in London, who are quite happy with the global context. They welcome globalization, and there are many in other parts of the country who strongly resist it, and this lay behind some of the voting patterns we saw in Brexit. The result of the referendum is a much more divided country, and that's what makes it so much more difficult to articulate a single position on what the UK wants.
Exactly.
As you know, I'm Scottish. The Scots voted differently from the English. The English voted differently from the Welsh and the Northern Irish. You find sectarian patterns in Northern Ireland. All these things feed into what has become a very, very uncomfortable debate, not just about Brexit, not just about European Union, but also about relations with the rest of the world.
Right.
And you see this even with the reactions to Trump.
So, Professor Begg, as a result of that, wouldn't that be so easy these days for politicians, for their own interests, their own little political interests, to hijack the whole nation's so-called national interests as a result of the division going on in the country, as a result of lack of ways to really assess what exactly those interests should be and are? Professor.
Well, the cynical answer is that the whole Brexit process dating back to 2013, when David Cameron first announced his intention to have a referendum, has been about internal Conservative Party politics. All the machinations we've seen over the last few weeks, the Chequers deal, the resignations from the government, these have been about internal Conservative Party politics. And sadly, we're no better endowed on the other side of the political spectrum with the Labour Party, which continues not to have a single coherent position on either Brexit or what kind of deal we're looking for. We are badly served by our politicians.
Unfortunately. We only have less than 2 minutes to go. Let me also have some views coming from Mr. Gross about that.
Of course, politics is always local. Therefore, it's understandable that you have different opinions. But I think perhaps the situation is not as dramatic as it appears. Professor Beck said we need an agreement very soon. But I would propose that maybe we can have just a fudge towards the end of this year, because after Brexit we have the interim period where everything for a while will continue as before, and maybe we'll have to give the UK perhaps more time so that it can really think over how it comes to grips with its own contradictions.
Right.
And then maybe we agree on the final relationship only in 1 or 2 years.
I see. Mr. Cui, before we go, also more than 30 seconds for you, sir.
Okay, I think now it's also a bigger test, not only for the internal politics, of course, in UK, and also not the wisdom of Theresa May and her colleagues. And also it's also a big test for European Union side. But anyway, because a kind of a softer landing of this very big issue, I mean Brexit, will be beneficial not only for UK and also for European Union. Otherwise, I think there will be a lose-lose situation for both.
That is always the rule, isn't it? But will that rule be followed? We'll see. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us in this ever-going debate. Cui Hongjian, Ian Beck, Daniel Gross, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on